to hear story, and we never get tired of it. And why not? Story is a life map. If you know the hero's journey, you know the work that Joseph Campbell did on the monomyth. How many of you know that? A little bit of that. Okay, so you know that he went, his whole life study reduced storytelling to here are the elements that you're going to find over and over again, called the monomyth. And current scholars right now are expanding it to include the heroine's journey, which differs slightly but significantly. But anyway, both of these monomyths are the structure of the journeys of our lives. There are always going to be calls to adventure, challenges, and ordeals, and we are going to face those ordeals and return to our lives with the elixir. Along the way in our journeys, there'll be enemies and allies and mentors, and we had better be able to tell them apart. And to recognize what each one is supposed to teach us. I would like us all right now to stop for a minute and check it out for yourselves. I'd like you to think of a rough patch you've had in the past, something that has come to some sort of resolution. Just take a minute and think of a really hard time. And then let's go through the stages of the hero journey and see if indeed they don't correspond to the things that happened to you. Isn't it true that initially you tried to reject the challenge when it called? Well, don't feel badly, that's what all heroes do when they get the call. Superheroes accept the call immediately. I'm Superman, of course I'll go to the rescue. But real heroes in the monomyth do not. They always say, you have the wrong person. Go check that again, I think you've made a mistake. We're mostly women in this room, so didn't that initial call to adventure find you in some form of domestic imprisonment that you may not even have noticed? I know my story that I always think of when I do this experiment. It certainly did. Well, that's a very common element in the heroine's opening situation. Did you next need to gather strength, perhaps need help from a mentor that you either sought out or who somehow appeared and found you? That's a very important stage in the hero's journey. Next, didn't you have to train and test yourself along the way, develop bonds with allies? Were you not surprised by tricksters, those people in your life who had always played a certain role, but now in this time of challenge surprised you by fulfilling an entirely different role? I'm thinking now of a friend of mine who had breast cancer, and she told me this, and she was so surprised. She said, once it happened and I needed help, the people I thought who were my rocks disappeared. And strangely enough, people like the UPS man, who was nothing more than someone to joke with her every couple of days, he became her rock. So that's the trickster role. It's someone who will take a different role in your story when the challenge happens. Didn't you find, all of us, that when you got to the heart of the challenge, what the monomyth structure calls the inmost cave, now you are really facing, you're really going deep into the challenge. Didn't you find out that it wasn't the challenge that was the challenge after all? It was whatever wound you carried into it that needed to be addressed. Isn't it true that you found out there was something about you that was missing or hurt or had not developed, and you needed to go work on that in order to go through this challenge? And in the end of it all, didn't you bring some gift back to your life that allowed you and your tribe to live more fully? Isn't that true? In a story, the arc of the action is often a mirror of the character's emotional arc. The arc of the action, that it rises and rises and rises and gets more dramatic and tense. And at the same time, the character's arc is falling. His emotional strength is just getting lower and lower until that final climax, and then they meet again. If we can learn to see this and the structure of challenges as narrative, it will give us courage. Most of all, becoming familiar enough with story form allows us to see meaning in our own lives. Much of life is suffering. If we can learn to see it as story, we can find meaning in it, and that's enormously comforting. Even better, it allows us to share our experiences in a form that the tribe will understand, in a way that bonds the community and encourages the community to care. All of the arts are wonderful at empathy building, but absolutely nothing beats a story for asking someone to step into another's life and care about it, and even more, to do something about it. I'm going to interrupt again. I want to talk to you a little tiny bit about PAX. I've called PAX the book of my life. 7 years ago, I finally had the seed for it, and I say finally because I had been for a long time. I had wanted to write a book that addressed the injustice of adults wage war, children pay for it. It seems that we need to, for me, I think we should count the costs of war to children before we go to war, before we engage. I think we should value those costs. Anyway, I did not have the writing muscles or the writing shoulder to handle that story. At the same time, I wanted to write a story about the radical empathy that children can show and form toward animals. And somehow that story didn't come either until 7 years ago. I was in Oklahoma, randomly doing a school visit, and a librarian stopped me and said, I love your book. Your book's Feral Girl. It reminds me of The Faithful Elephants. Do you know that book?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it The Patient Elephants? I've forgotten. Anyway, I said, oh no, I don't know what that is. What is it? And she said, Elephants, Tokyo, World War II, and then the kids came in, and I never saw that librarian again. And I'm so glad I didn't, because for weeks I went, elephants, sentient animals, commenting on war. And I knew then I was going to combine those two themes into one book. 7 years later, I still can't wipe the blood out of my studio from that book. It's because Ann Patchett writes about this. When you start a book, when you're an author and you start a book and it's been in your head as a possibility for so long, it's this gorgeous butterfly that shimmers, and no one has ever seen anything more wonderful than this book you're going to write. It's going to address everything. It's going to be just amazing. And then she says, finally, you have to go to your studio and actually start writing. And she said, with that pen, you stab that butterfly, and it's dead. All the life drains out of it, because now it's just you and your poor sentences, you know. Anyway, that happened to me not just once when I started it, but over and over, because I keep a sign over my writing desk that says, the story is the boss. It's the only piece of writing advice that never changes. I put other things around, but that one stays because for me, it's a Zen cone. It answers everything. It is at the core of everything I need to learn about storytelling. And for this time, it kept saying, the story kept saying to me, write it tougher. Write it tougher. It is a tough book because one of the themes is the things that happen to children when adults are waging war. But what saved it for me was being able to write the other theme, the radical empathy that children can form, bonds with animals like species. I don't see that as a boundary. I will give it true love, true respect. Anyway, that made the writing a joy, along with the fact that I decided to write it from a point of view of a fox, which was such a thrill for me. The more I studied foxes, the more respectful I became of them, and I wanted to treat them with dignity, and I changed the whole book. It was going to be kind of an Animal Farm thing, going to be anthropomorphized highly, and the more I learned about the foxes, the more I said, they deserve my respect. I'm going to treat them just the way I would a human character, with respect, with dignity and honesty and kindness. This became a huge pleasure for me, and I hope for the reader. As PAX is coming out in the world, I have one fear. It's that people will search for morals in the book. I admit it's thick with theme and very heavy subjects, but I reject the word moral. If I were God's own spiritual advisor, I would not proselytize. I promise. I would try really hard not to. But as I mentioned before, what I hope comes up are questions. Questions are the interesting thing. So as you go out and share this book, or as your readers come back to you and say, I read this book and I have a question, here are some of the ones that I hope come up. I hope people think, well, how are we balanced between wild and civilized, both inside ourselves and outside in the world? How are we related to nature? I like the question, I bring this up whenever I talk to schools. If you were a refugee, what would you take with you? What 3 things would you take with you? What 3 things would be hardest to leave? Those are interesting conversations to have with kids. And of course the big one, what are the costs of war? Tonight there are over 60 million refugees because of war, and half of them are kids. 30 million kids who don't have homes tonight. They don't have their pillows, their toys, their books, their pets. How many have lost parents or siblings for short periods of time or forever? How many will lose a chance at education, physically scarred, emotionally scarred? The answers are numbers that no one can hold in their heart. We just can't do it. So here's the big gift of story. Story distills the overwhelmingly enormous into something manageable and personal and relatable. I want to reassure you today, as you're sending packs out, or packs is coming back into you through readers, that your readers can handle the story of one fox and one boy who become separated and love each other and must face great challenges in order to be reunited. And now back to our regular schedule.